sense others, our ability to empathize with others. In other words, what's in the center of this learning capacity is a curiosity, a deep curiosity about others and about things that we don't know, and our ability as a team to quickly understand and explore new arenas, be it again a domain of knowledge or a new process or a new need. And indeed, if we were to compare two companies, if you were to compare your startup to a relatively similar firm, and think about your ability to produce a product that is similar to theirs. Now, one thing to distill the difference and make sure that we're comparing apples to apples is to say, well, imagine we have the same budget, right? We have the same initial budget. We're able to raise X amount of money. The second variable, we're starting at the same time, so there's no benefit in being, having a jump start. What else? Well, let's say we're really hiring from the same talent pool. That is, we're really relying on the same. So in other words, we'll have a similar level of expertise in that domain, right? So then, once you really equalize all those things, my question would be to you then, how's your startup different? I mean, everything seems like to be the same, at least initial stage, resource-wise. You're starting at the same time, you have the same amount of money, and you have the same level of expertise. That is at all levels, be it engineering personnel, be it the management, be it the marketing. And so one area that I'd like you to think about deeply is that your team's ability to learn faster than the competitor when all other things are equal would necessarily be the requirement for you to produce a more innovative product faster, better. So please think about it, and I would really be curious about your feedback and how you think about what learning means for your team, for your organization. And so one way I'd like to think about learning fast is known as design thinking. I'm sure many of you have heard this concept. I believe there's a session, a dedicated session on design thinking. Haikas told me, and I'm sure you'll benefit greatly. I encourage you to take it. I don't know what the content is, but I like to think that it would be very, very relevant to our discussion. Maybe even perhaps some of the concepts we'll discuss today would be applicable, or be able to compare and generate some ideas and see the differences and see what it means for you. So this is the definition that Tim Brown, the executive chair of IDEO, provides. And IDEO, as you know, is one of the preeminent consulting design companies that have been practicing the design thinking as a discipline. Again, they're not the ones who invented it, but they're the ones who are quite known for championing it, and definitely are one of the practitioners of this discipline. And so they define it as a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. And so what I read here is really the formula for making your organization into a learning one. That is the one that is able, that has a process, that has a journey map to guide itself on this learning path to discover the value that is sought by the customers, or discover the unmet need, ability to learn quickly about the market and the competitors and understand whether what the requirements will be for business success in the market by looking at the value chain and the partners, as well as quickly learn about the possibilities of technology. And if there is there is promise and innovation and opportunity that would enable the development of the product. And so 3 lenses that were summarized in the previous slide, yeah, I can, if you recall, so one is about customer needs, and we call that desirability. That is, you want to develop something that people want or need. And again, as we discussed during the last session, it's not necessarily something they might not know yet, it might be late in it, but eventually this is something that people want to use, and this helps them to solve a problem. So desirability is the key. And indeed, as you can see, that's where we want to start our process. And this is why design thinking is termed to be a human-centered approach, is because we want to find, we want to reflect on what people need and want to sense what they need, and that underpins the development of the product. Now, feasibility relates to technological feasibility. That is, there is already a technology developed that could be used, repurposed to develop the product or the service that you propose. Yeah? So that refers to technological. It's not something that is still in R&D, that is not proven. And this is, we can discuss that separately. But for the purposes of really distilling the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that we want the technology for the product to be available. And I'll explain in a little while why this is important. And of course, viability. And by viability, we mean the economic viability. That is, what would be the requirements for the product or service, in fact, to make sense business-wise. So for example, just to give an example, I might indeed be able to come up with a product that addresses customer need. And in fact, there could be technology already available to develop that product. Yet based on the proposed product design, the market conditions might make it really not a viable option because of the competitive landscape, because of the pricing, or most often the cost of developing the product. So the feasibility really can be defined as an operational feasibility when it comes to technology, and the viability also can be defined operationally as team's ability on a business side to develop the product. So the innovation opportunity necessarily requires that these 3 areas overlap, that they're all present. That what we're developing is desired by the customers, they need it addresses a real unmet need, that it's technologically feasible, and that also makes sense business-wise. And that's in that intersection, that's where the magic happens, and that's where the innovation opportunity manifests itself. And so when we think about that little area in the previous slide, at the intersection of the desirability, feasibility, and viability, how do we want to think about, how do we arrive to that insight? How do we, how we can replicate a process, let's try to structure a process where innovation can be routinely achieved. That is, we can develop this innovation muscle within the company. That as well, if you do A, B, C, and D, you will be in a better position, or will have much higher probability to come up with something really cool, creative, and innovative if you were just doing it without a certain process. And indeed, the design thinking is designed to structure, that is, to be able to achieve an innovation, an innovative success repetitively. Yeah, something that we can develop as a capacity in our organization. And as I said, what really underlies that ability is our ability to learn fast. So one way to think about it, and I use this graphic, which will explain what the information is. I use this graphic is really to convey one way to think about innovation as a let's say, statistical result. So in that sense, this quote by Linus Pauling, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, is quite relevant. So he simply said the best way to have good ideas is to have a lot of ideas. And I'd like you to also think about that. So what I have here is two dimensions. Imagine at the bottom, at the horizontal axis, is the one with called complexity of your ideas, of your innovative insights. To the left, you have your obvious ideas or the mainstream ideas, and something that is generated on a daily basis by probably a large number of companies. Things that will already take it for more or less for granted. And through your innovative process and through your design thinking pipeline that we'll discuss stages in the next slide, this is what we're trying to achieve, right? To really push beyond the obvious ideas, right? And of course, even closer, more to the left, you have even more obvious or you say trivial ideas, and hence perhaps the number of ideas that you could generate for this process would be less. But the maximum ideas that you can really generate would be in that central part. I don't know if my mouse is visible, but this is where you would have most of the sort of mainstream ideas that are being implemented or about to be implemented. And as you push further to the right, well, this is where you were hoping you'd be able to find something, marginally innovative, something more interesting you can add on to it. So what I mean by innovation space, which is the title of this slide, one of the key concepts of the design thinking pipeline is through ideation to arrive to a large number of ideas, right? And we'll see why. And this is what Linus Pauling says with his quote, and I'd like to think that he also had the same concept in mind. Is that we can, of course, encourage really ridiculous ideas. I call them wild ideas. I mean, things that perhaps are even dangerous or offensive, depends on the context. Is something that is really has nothing to do with the real world. Something can be from the future. It could be fantastic ideas. And a key requirement of the design thinking process is to indeed encourage these ideas. And one reason to do this, and this is the time that I would really love to invite your participation and your feedback via chat, is to maybe give me some idea why do you think it is important through ideation, through this process, to be able to generate what I call a long tail of ideas. Yeah, so this is a distribution of ideas, and this is a long tail. What we mean by a long tail is that the number of the mainstream ideas will be perhaps more, but as you go into wilder, more complex, more unexpected ideas, you might get them. There will be more of them. They will be different. They will be all less constrained, but there will be also less of them. And why this is important? So really, what this graphic shows you is that you want a lot of ideas. But what we're also adding to this idea of a number of ideas, we're also adding that there have to be, there should be variance between the ideas, right? You want them to be different from each other. So one way to think about this is, imagine if you were to do this. Imagine you stopped right here, yeah, somewhere close to your, what we call a knowledge border. Yeah? Well, what would happen is that probably the discussion within your team would center around this obvious, what we call mainstream idea. And while you may be able to push through that border and come with something marginal, the risk is that because you will be constrained by the discussion that is a bit more judgmental, perhaps from the very beginning, we shut down some of the crazy ones. We say, hey, we can't really do that one. It's technologically not feasible. And we're really then constraining ourselves and limiting ourselves to this area. The way I like to think about the long tail requirement is we want necessarily to extend this as much as we can to create the space where our team could engage with many more ideas, and perhaps there will be indeed be a feasible, desirable, and viable one that's somewhere in the middle that otherwise wouldn't have manifested itself if we were to limit ourselves to a more constrained discussion or ideation process. Right? So what we're trying to say is that yes, with this, you're going to generate a lot of ideas, and a lot of them would be not necessarily what your final insight or solution might be. And indeed, the objective of those ideas is not necessarily, and in fact, primarily is not to come up with an insight, but provide the space and a distribution of ideas that will be diverse and high enough in terms of numbers that it would indeed, those combinations that we said before, the combinations of those ideas, or the mushing up of those ideas would eventually lead to an insight that otherwise you won't have the space to discuss with your team. So think of this about a statistical result of being able to generate a long tail of ideas within your team. That is the ability of your team to work collaboratively, creatively, in non-judgmental, in not analyzing process that is able to generate this level of ideas and this level of variance between the ideas. So the reason I wanted you to give this graphic first is to give you sort of a theoretical underpinning for why this is an important, especially in the ideation stage, and why this is the key tool in achieving the rate of learning that will be requisite for your innovation requirement, how fast you would have to innovate as a company. Now, obviously, this is in fact a necessary but not a sufficient requirement, and we'll see why. So a skeleton, if you will, of a design thinking process has these four key components, and they would often refer to this design process, a journey map. So at the first stage, we really want to learn, right? We want to really listen, we want to relate, we want to listen with your eyes, as Ideo would put it, to get inspired. And by getting inspired, and I think they call it gather inspiration, what we're really trying to understand is what is it that people want? What is it that is hurting them? And really get inspired by the opportunity to help them, right? You have to really care and really be interested in the subject matter of what you're trying to do, and have really deep curiosity and really, really strong optimism and desire to help people in the scenario that you're engaging. It's only then you're able to understand and see the needs that perhaps are not so obvious, right? And really, this is the step that allows you to develop an understanding of what the problem is, right? So what you're really trying to do at this first step of listening is you're trying to do what we're trying really to do with all our slides, so with both presentations. We're trying to arrive to the questions, yeah? How we can help to solve a certain problem, how we can help this group of people or this business or this customer target audience to solve that problem. Then we'll go for a process when we generate ideas, again, based on the frameworks that I just suggested and quoted by the Linus, by the Nobel laureate, that many more ideas eventually result in one or two that are worth pursuing. The third step is perhaps most critical, in the sense that it highlights, I believe, in many ways, the key difference between the design thinking process and what you would think of as more regular engagement with the problem. You probably heard of a concept of learning by making. That is a process where you can explore a subject by prototyping, and we'll see how it's done in detail later. So for now, think of it as another tool, in fact, as a principal tool that helps you learn faster. And I encourage you to think about time in your lives when you could say, well, this was a day, this was one experience when I truly learned a lot in a very short period of time. And for many people, it's usually the time when they were engaged in doing something. That is, they were engaged in fact, exercising and executing on an idea, making it tangible, thus allowing them to test it and also to share it with others, which is really the last step of the cycle, which is an ongoing cycle. And we share this with storytelling. We share this by making the problem and the proposed solution part of a context that is very real, that is indeed emotional, that is connected to sensory input, as evocative, that really allows the testers and our audience and whoever will involve in our design thinking process to think about, what happens, what are the limitations, and what are the opportunities. And then we iterate. We'll go back to step one, and we ask a better question. Right? We, in a way, artificially limit the time we go through this cycle in order to arrive to a better question, structured in a way that with every iteration, we're inching closer towards the final product. And so this is, in fact, a more elaborate flow of this process that has some definitions of tools that are being used. More specifically, this is, in fact, the process that we apply religiously in our own company. And that proved to be a revolutionary for us, not only in terms of our ability as a team to innovate fast and to really come up with wonderful ideas and implementation fast, but interestingly enough, or perhaps as importantly, it really helped to bring the team together. So there are some interesting outcomes following engagement in design thinking that brings combined creativity of the team and the morale. And it's been really a wonderful experience for my team. And so here what I'm proposing is that for the listening stage, there are a number of ways you would engage with your audience to understand what their needs are. And we don't have time and space with this within this session to talk at length about how you would engage or design that type of interaction. But it can range from thought experiments that you can do within your team and think how you can learn and relying on your personal experiences to make this a really cost-effective learning exercise, or really invest in it and spend time by research and by engaging potentially with customers, following them, listening to them. Some studies, in fact, take months to complete, would involve engaging with the beneficiaries very closely. For example, if you were developing a solution for farming in rural Armenia, an exercise of this caliber would involve perhaps relocating to physically and living with the beneficiary on a farmland and understanding how they go about their daily life. Ideas come from very unusual places, paying attention to their routines. People often do and engage in routines because they're trying to solve a problem that is not been solved for them. Things as, focusing on their behavior, on posture or manners as they consider a problem or a situation. Trying to really unlock insights that are not necessarily obvious, that even the beneficiaries don't quite realize. They might be used to doing certain things because, well, they don't have a solution for it, so they have all these shortcuts for accomplishing certain tasks. And so observing, learning, and listening with your eyes and paying attention to the context of your beneficiary's problem is a very powerful tool in learning more and uncovering the unmet need. And so we call this 5 whys, because eventually we want to arrive to that problem definition, right? We want to understand who will be helping, who are our customers, what problem we'll be solving for them, when and what context, that is there a physical or geographical context where I should consider my solution? Is there a timing context where I should consider my solution? It can be, timing can be defined as on an annual or calendar or seasonal basis, which might be relevant for agricultural products or services, or it might have some daily or even hourly significance depending on the problem. So these 5 whys are really designed for you to map the space where your problem manifests itself and understanding what your solution is going to provide. How, when, why, when, what, right? So really mapping out and visualizing the space where your solution would exist and help. And why we're really doing this, right? Why are we so keen on defining this question? Especially since we're saying that by the end of this process, we'll be coming back and revising it, right? Well, because it starts with a question, right? And what the idea, for example, suggests is that they ask the question, how we might be able or solve this question. What really they're trying, so that how is inviting. It's a challenge that there's an optimism there. We is collaborative, and might is optimistic. So framing question that way invites the team to work on it. And of course, the key requirement for this stage is to agree on that question. It doesn't mean there will be change, but if we want our process to be successful, we want the team to be on the same page. So by the time you're ready to think about the problem, you want to agree on the words, on all of the words that went into that problem, right? Because throughout ideation, what happens is that we often find ourselves going back and reframing the question, which is indeed part of the process, part of the iteration. So the better it's framed, the more actionable it becomes. And so your ideation becomes much more effective. So as we just discussed, ideation is the process when the problem we're trying to solve, we invite the team to really focus on generating as many ideas as possible. That's really single most important goal of the ideation step. And toward that objective, in order to satisfy that requirement, so that many ideas are generated and the variance is great among these ideas, we want to make sure that the team is quite comfortable expressing them, right? Because ideas spark new ideas. So everything and every participation counts. And normally it's the equal participation that counts. Ability to listen to your teammates, that's what counts. Being not judgmental or really taking out all the limitations. So this is not the time to speak about technological limitations, that this can't really be done. In fact, the opposite is true. Encouraging and matching up things that are not expected to be together is one of the tools, for example, ideation process uses to generate new ideas. And just to give you an example, if you are coming up, for example, a problem to survey crop, and what you were thinking, because you're a drone specialist, to use a drone technology, some of the two things that you can match up could be maybe a product or a produce, and other thing that surrounds or can be found on a farm. For example, it can be animal, could be people, could be equipment. But there's nothing to do with the drone, right? But once you match up those things, and suddenly say, well, if I were to match up, a horse and an apple, what does it tell me about, what ideas can I come up with that have something to do with the crop surveillance, right? It could be something that has nothing to do with surveillance or with drones, but really allows you to think about almost thought pieces that could come together or can be inspired by this discussion. So the idea, again, perhaps initially in its heart, albeit artificially, to generate as many ideas as possible, right? And making sure that they're amplified and vocalized. So one trick that we're using, we're writing down all these ideas so they're all visible. Everybody gets a turn, and they all end up on a board where everybody can see them. What we do afterwards is that we look at them, we group them. It's often ideas relate to a certain similar idea group, and we look at it together. We would then have each participant and team would have a number of votes they could give to a certain idea group. For example, you would have 5 stars. Each participant gets 5 stars, and they can really tag the ideas. And then that's how we come up with a winning idea. And by winning, I mean the idea that everybody thinks is interesting enough, is perhaps most delightful, or at that stage most practical to try. Now, everybody wants to try that one first. And what we mean by trial, what we mean is, we want to make it tangible. We just discussed with this really crazy idea. The question, what would be the next step to understanding this idea actually has some life? Is how do we want to really try it and ourselves get excited about it, but also get to a point where we can share it with others so others can try it. Now, don't get me wrong, this is, of course, a maker approach. I don't want to make it, want to sketch it will be the very first thing to do. And that's why one of the requirements of the design thinking process is to have a visually inclined team member. Ideally, all of us would be comfortable with sketching and drawing. It also takes some time. Some people feel they're not good, but it really doesn't take much. It's important to encourage that, to visualize it. And research actually shows it's one thing to write down what works, it's another thing to draw. And in fact, even in the ideation stage, we try to not just write down the ideas, but actually draw them on the board. And indeed, they tend to be the ones that we remember the most. And so the prototype, or the first version of this sketch, a really scrub one, could be a very loose depiction of the idea. Because as we draw it, as you implement it, new questions come up. In fact, you learn by making it. And so what happens is it allows very quickly to huddle around and make new decisions. Say, all right, well, what do I have learned? I mean, this is something we want to go back and reframe the question. And once you put a certain time limitation for this making process, say we got to be done in 1 hour, right? It really forces you to come up with the most important things or capture the most important things at that stage. And that's done at the expense of quality, because that's not the objective. The objective is really to get through that process to as fast as possible. Once it's done, the question to ask is, all right, let's play with it. So you play with it a little bit and you understand, well, this part works, this doesn't work. And playing can be really a thought experiment. If it's a drawing, then in your mind with your team, you can go for different scenarios of, if it's actually a physical version of something you build, a drone that now is made from a cardboard, just to give an idea of its dimensions and some of the functions it might have, then you might actually touch it and have a better understanding how it might feel. And so once it's done, what we're trying to do at that point to say, well, guys, imagine we had 10 more minutes or we had 1 more hour. What would be our next step? What we've done differently or add or subtract, again, to learn faster, that is to arrive to even better questions. And so what usually happens is that through this process, through this cycle, we get to an iteration where we go back to a problem definition and we refine it. And we go through another cycle. This time, we spend more time on prototyping because we're ready to commit to this idea. And we're saying, well, it's worth investing more. We may spend another week and develop even more sophisticated prototype, right? Which will be even more fun to play, and will let us to really fine tune some of the idea concepts. And of course, the third and fourth, and soon enough, the team realizes that we have our alpha version, beta version of the product, and it can be really and truly a rewarding process. Now, often, of course, throughout this process, you arrive to what you call a dead end, which I really find rather a negative way to define it. In fact, for the purposes of this process, I will encourage you to seek dead ends because they provide the biggest return on investment for this process. Because the sooner you arrive to a failure, that is, the faster you can fail your prototype, then the faster you can really give up an idea that wasn't going anywhere. In many ways, you can give up the idea that, with the first prototype, then it's a wonderful outcome because you know that for 100%, that's not the branch you want to pursue. The biggest issue with the startups is the fallacy of the sunk cost. The startups who learn to innovate fast, to learn fast and give up their ideas are usually the ones that succeed eventually. The ones that keep working on their ideas, on a single idea for a long time, are usually the ones who perish. I mean, it's almost think of an innovation process and the statistical concept that I shared with the long tail of ideas. Being a startup is not like, entering a room full of the surprise, imagine surprise balls, right? You have to, maybe there are thousands of them in this field, in this room. And one or two of them, in fact, have that surprise in them. The rest are empty. And your role as a startup is to really go through them, open them up one by one, and discover that inside and, come up with that unicorn idea. So the question is, well, as I, amplified at the beginning of this session, imagine all the variables are equal. Your company has the same resources as another startup next door. So really your true ability to arrive to this insight would be your ability to go through those balls in a way that will be faster. That is, you can do brute force, right? You can just go out and say, well, I'll just keep, whatever, randomly picking up these balls, opening them up to see which one has a unicorn idea inside. Or you can say, well, maybe there's a better way. Maybe as a team, I can think about, well, what's the best way to generate these ideas, as many of them as possible, so that I can arrive to the unicorn idea faster than my competitors, right? How I define the composition of my team that is diverse enough that I have a business specialist to address the viability issue. I have an engineer and a maker that can speak to the technological development as well as feasibility, and in fact make the prototype. Do I have a person who would help me understand what people want? Do I need a behavioral specialist on my design thinking team? Of course. Do I want actually another one who would be in charge of the process itself and help coordinate and facilitate these discussions and keep check on the team and encourage and guide it as we go through this process, right? So thinking about that ability, your ability to combine and work within your team would be indeed that capacity to find the unicorn idea. Your competitor team that had the same amount of money to begin with, perhaps even was able to hire talent from the same talent pool. Your ability to bring your team together differently, bring your team and inspire them around a purpose, around helping customers to solve their problem, really galvanizing that energy around something like this would be key to your ability to arrive to that idea faster. Will be key to your ability to learn faster than your competitor. And so the next few pages, this is a template I borrowed online from Calendarvote. And the reason I really wanted to share this one with you is because it has an empty version here, but it also has this black page, but also has all those, an example of a grocery store, but has all the descriptions that would help you understand what the customer journey mapping is. And the reason I want to share with you this page, because as we discussed on the Venn diagram, the desirability is where you want to start your journey. And that's where the listening and discovering the customer needs and defining your problem is the first step. This is how your team would get inspired to solve the problem, to be challenged to solve the problem. And to do that, we have this tool, which we call customer journey mapping, where we truly try to analyze the triggers that drive the customer behavior, to understand the triggers that perhaps even result or in a perception of a problem, as well as to understand what are those non-obvious behavioral patterns that may be indicative of an underlying latent need. Right? So I'd like you to carefully review that consumer journey map and also review the empty template. As a homework, as an exercise, I'd like you to consider the complete, and we can start doing it now, would be to complete the customer journey mapping for your specific circumstance. That is, if you are in a service category, you can think about your customer profile. And a good tool to do that is to, in fact, imagine your customer and describe them in detail, not just some generic abstract user type, but that as a person has a name, age, hair color, profession, hobbies, interests, in a very much a storytelling format. Something you can tell your team and they could imagine that person within a very certain context. It could be 26-year-old, newly graduate, tired, comes home late from work and has his dinner and then gets on his iPad and this is what he does on his iPad. Or this is, so imagine really, and the reason we're doing this is to really understand the context of those 5 whys, because in imagining and telling this story, well, first of all, we're communicating the setting so that our team could imagine it. And then we'll listen to each other because then the story gets more interesting. And that also gives us a starting point to think about that person and that person's needs. And so the last template, the custom profiles, is really what it's designed to do, is to allow you to list your custom profiles, describe them, describe the problem you think that the customer is experiencing, again, based on a level of engagement that you can afford to do. In fact, in many ways, as a startup, you don't have the resources of established firms to engage fully with your customer base. So you can start within your team. You can start with your friends and family. You can start with 1 or 2 potential customers that you can afford to go and discuss at length. And again, often people would not be able to tell you what their problem is. So really listening with your eyes, observing them within the context where the problem manifests itself would be the way to do it. And again, the format of today's conversation doesn't allow us to go at length. Each of these steps is a quite exciting arena of both research and practice. I hope that with your design session, you would have an opportunity to really discuss this at a deeper level. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I really wanted to try and make this session a bit more interactive. And so I believe we have at least another half hour that are really to engage, and any volunteers who would like to share some of their startup ideas, what stage their startup is, and any questions or guidance we would would need to try this process. So hi guys, at this stage, I'd really like to invite our audience to participate. I would like you to, if you're not ready to speak, perhaps you can consider this template. And as you start thinking about how to complete them, I think you'll have more questions why this is important and how this could help you. And it also helped me if you could give me context for your ventures. So please, you can submit the questions via chat, or you could speak up and just maybe 2 or 3 sentences about your business.
Guys, you can do through chat as well if you have difficulties. What if we pick up like some of them, like random, and ask them to talk? Any volunteers for now? Okay, what about you, Daniel? I can see you in my screen first, actually. Daniel, could you please do the exercise that Art asked?
Sorry, can you clarify what exactly I'm supposed to say again? You want me to just say what I'm working on?
Artjan, could you please move to the slide to the request?
Yes, it would be helpful for me if you have a question, if you're seeking an answer or you want something to be clarified, if you could share maybe briefly what your startup does, what your idea is, and what stage it is.
Okay, well, I can share a bit of what I'm trying to do. My company is called Agrosoko, and basically what I'm trying to do is we're building a business-to-business marketplace that is meant to bridge the gap between marginalized grain farmers and large offtake buyers of grains in Tanzania. And I like your whole lecture, especially on the innovation space that you've just left out, because we went through this process and we had obvious ideas and we had to collect some insights, and then we started dwindling down all the way to the more clear ideas. So that's most of what we're trying to do. Yeah. As far as questions, I think everything was pretty clear on my end. No questions really.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing. This is, I'm glad that this has been helpful.
Anyone else guys wishing to share the idea and questions? After I assume we can continue if the question will rise. So they are asked to write in the chat. So we can.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I mean, the rest of the time, I'd really like you to try and complete as much as you can. And this is again, objective is not really to finish it, but rather, even if you start thinking about how to complete at least one part of those templates, my hope is that it would really inspire you and trigger you to think deeply about your customers, as well as for you to start on this journey. So I understand from what I heard from Daniel, they did try the design thinking exercise, and that would be very helpful, Daniel, if I can again address you. What was the challenge, and what would you do differently? And is there anything from today's session that I could clarify to help you sort of push beyond those obvious ideas?
Well, what we had experienced initially was the challenge of bringing in the right approach towards the problem we're trying to solve. So it's kind of very, in the beginning, we were working with a lot of assumptions, and we thought the obvious technology that would meet the farmers' challenges was gonna work, but then we figured out that it wasn't working. So maybe I can get into more detail about the whole process we went to, but I feel like I might hijack your whole lecture. So, but maybe if I give you a summary, is that we started out with a USSD and SMS kind of bot, trying to get farmers to give us information of what they have available, and then we quickly realized that we weren't getting accurate data on the availability of the grains that the farmers have, because they weren't really updating on the platform regularly. So our next approach was more to get the farmers involved, but kind of take the technology a step away from the farmers. And we realized that in the rural areas, they have warehouses where most of the farmers go and co-store their grains. So we decided to deploy a technology in the warehouses where, instead of dealing with multiple farmers, we're dealing with one person who is basically keeping track of what is going in and going out of that warehouse. So that was kind of our pivot that I think resonates with what you discussed about in design thinking. And we've used that approach many times, design thinking, the steps in order to figure out what works. Yeah.
Excellent, Daniel. And I'm sure this was not it's wonderful that you shared this, because, you know, each startup and circumstance has some interesting lessons for others, even if they're not, you know, in a related field. What's interesting and what caught my attention is that you said you thought that what you're offering will be helpful. And interesting enough, you considered a technology that would help farmers to communicate the data. What I can tell from my experience, often the underlying motivation for farmers or for really any customer to part with their data can be very complicated. From, you know, I guess, desire to keep some of this data private, to obfuscate it from other farmers who can be competitors, often in a platform type of setting, which sounds like your startup is engaged in a platform-like business. Often the price discovery is a problem, as you want to be part of the platform, yet you necessarily don't want your customers to be easily comparing your prices with the prices of your competitors. So what I really like what you said is that you were able to go through this process and pivot, right? And so task for every startup, the ability. Hi, Kajan, are you asking me a question?
No, sorry, Archon. Sorry. It was sorry.
And so what I really like what Daniel said, because that's really reminded me to amplify the following. He mentioned that they had to do this pivot, which looked like a major pivot. Based on understanding, well, we really in a business of information, and Daniel, please correct me if I'm wrong, and we wanted to be accurate, and maybe we should just, it would be much easier to extract that information from the warehouse, where it can be the fidelity of the data can be trusted. And so the question then becomes, as a startup, do you have the luxury of the pivot, right? What's your runway? And runway defined as your, the time that you have while you can still make a pivot decision, right? That's really your runway. And again, we'll go back as well, how do you know? And again, it's your ability as a firm to discover it, to learn. And so I know whether Daniel thought things that they were able to pivot in time, or would it be better to do it sooner, or what would have helped them to arrive to that decision sooner, right? What changes to the decision, to design thinking and decision process they went through, what are the changes they can make so that, again, looking back and engaging in a further design thinking exercise, they can ensure that they could arrive and they can really, in that sense, make those decisions soon, and again, save costs and be in a position to compete with others.
Yeah, maybe I can add to a little bit of what you said. Other than just the accuracy of data, because it's a marketplace, we're dealing with two different parties, and we had to find a way to make sense of things for both parties. See, in every marketplace, there's a chicken and egg kind of situation, and everyone has to trust the marketplace in order to transact through it. So the accuracy of data was one of the most important things that we had to consider when we're dealing with buyers who are coming to buy massive amounts of grain from a number of farmers. But other than that, it was also a cost issue. Our initial solution that we wanted to deploy was more costly than the next solution, because let's say if you're doing USSD sessions or you're doing SMSs, if you're to look at in the long run, your costs become higher when you're dealing with a larger number of farmers. So there might be small costs at the beginning. Let's say if one farm sends one text message, usually when you're working with aggregators for USSD sessions and text messages, they charge the company. So if you're dealing with a small number of farmers, it's fine. But if you're scaling up and you're dealing with 100,000 or 1 million farmers, you come and find out that it's not viable. Yeah.
I don't know, can you give us an idea of what are the numbers we're talking about? Is the marketplace functioning now?
Right now, we're piloting it in a region where we're trying to get on board about 139,000 farmers, and in 13 warehouses. But these are large warehouses that can accommodate about 4,000 tons of grains max. So we're looking at about 40 to 45,000 tons of grains as a potential amount of grain that you're going to onboard into our system. But we're still piloting the solution. But that's the whole picture. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And like you said, the chicken and egg problem, and I think I spoke about this briefly during our first session. And since we're talking about Daniel's business and it's a platform strategy, I'd like you to give you just a few concepts regarding platforms, as I imagine some of you might also be trying to be to adopt that model. So as you know, platform is in many ways, if you can think about it as a fancy word for monopoly in a certain domain. That is, you want to have enough of, let's call it, horizontal presence in the value chain that you can become a market maker, right? You can transact, and you can have two or more sites to a platform. So, for example, Amazon is a good example. Daniel's business, you have buyers and sellers of grain, but you can have other participants as well, right? So, for example, you can have in case of, for example, App Store, you have both the app developers and you have obviously the users of the applications. So it can be, platforms can be multiple sided. And the way to think about the chicken and egg problem, I'd really like again to necessarily think of it in dynamic terms, Daniel, right? So this is why, if anything, I'd like to leave you when it comes to platform. And I'm sure now when you're trying to onboard over 100,000 participants on one side, is to understand that it's really the dynamic balance between the participants on both sides that makes the platform a valuable proposition, right? So you have to have enough of interest on number on one side of the platform to generate the requisite interest on the other and vice versa. So as part of your marketing strategy, you really have a piloting strategy. You have to really think hard how you would apply the design thinking principles to experiment and test your pilot. That will give you some insights on how you would approach this balancing act of growing platform on both sides. That's both growing the number of buyers as well as growing the number of farmers. That's number one. Number two, you would have to think, and I'm sure you've already put a great deal of thought on how you would price your model, right? What side are you going to charge? And of course, you want to make sure that the price sensitive side is spared the brunt of your business model, right? So this is also, and this is something that can also change with time. Is there anything you could share with us on pricing model?
So initially, we had thought about doing a commission model on the farmer side, but we keep getting a lot of information and insight about, farmers, they don't earn much of an income. So we can't keep the price pressure just towards them. So we're still going to test these things. We're still going to test different types of business models and see what works. But I think we're going to be looking at both commission and margin, kind of a mixture of both commission and margin. And then also we're going to be doing subscriptions for the buyers later on, because we're also providing them a lot of value compared to the current way they source their grains, which involves a lot of middlemen and a very extended supply chain and margins added on top on every step of the way. So we want to see whether we, later on, after we've proved the value to them, we want to see whether we can start charging them subscription to use a much simpler sourcing channel compared to what they can use, what they've used before, and with much more traceability.
So when you speak of traceability, Daniel, have you thought of, well, let me ask you this question. And again, I hope this is also should be interesting to other participants, because this is really goes back to our first session and trying to distill the value that you're bringing to your customers, in this case, to both sides of the platform for Daniel's business, is really understanding what is it, why a customer would, what is the problem that I'm solving? It is really finding the buyer for my grain, and for the buyer, it is really a matching problem. Is this really a problem of technology? Is this really reducing cost for them to transact? Is this really just, part of it is a trust? Yeah, you're just reducing cost of transaction because this is a site and this is a transaction with trust. Just give you an example. For example, is our warehouse receipt a problem? Is innovation in, for example, digitizing this workflow, the document workflow that is required to transact grain, would be a value add? It is something that could also apply. There was, in fact, an interesting project by MIT Media Lab's blockchain technology group that specifically targeted warehouse receipts based on a blockchain platform to distribute those ledgers, specifically for produce warehouses with grain. In fact, they piloted this, I believe, in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, as well as Ukraine was considering it. So it's quite a recent project that was attempted. Daniel, you can look it up. It's one of the agri-tech projects of MIT Media Lab's blockchain initiative. And so in thinking about this, again, it's very important to understand what is it, the value that we are developing. Is this a value also, is this recognized? Is it something that the farmers would indeed find to be rewarding? And then, like you said, because they're so price sensitive, maybe there's a way to price this for the buyers that would tactically provide advantage for the growth, for the balanced growth on both sides of the platform. And then again, it is something that would allow me to capture, are there competitors, are there other solutions, and would the farmers or buyers find ways to transact outside the platform, right? So that would be, I guess, the other risk to them. And then, of course, who are the partners, my value chain partners that I will be relying on to deliver this service? Is it just my ability to rely on the technology and an online infrastructure that, and whether that would be outsourced? Would I be relying then on for example, the warehouse partnerships for data accuracy? And so these are, and what is it exactly I would need from my partners to succeed, and how much of that platform value then I could extract. As I said, the platform strategy could be extremely lucrative once it's successful. It's also equally challenging to get to that stage because this is intrinsically a dynamic problem that would require you to innovate fast, would require you to innovate in terms of your technology platform, and perhaps much more importantly, innovate with your marketing in trying to maintain that balancing act between two sides of your platform. Are there any other examples in the audience that are relevant to Daniel's business, or if any of these discussions prompted more questions?
Is anyone from Invent team here? Maybe you can also raise some questions if you have any. So the floor is open for you as well. So if you are here and have some questions and want to share your idea and your perspectives, you are free to do that.
Hi, it's Irina. Hi.
Hi.
I would like to share our experience. Our idea was initially to help HRs to scrape information and build convenient tool for recruitment. Then we spoke to HRs and understood that they have a lot of tools like that, and more interesting for them will be culture fit analysis and analysis of personality of people entering the company. And we understood we should work on that field, and that there is less competition, and we could do, or not less competition, I would say less solutions to make their life easier. All solutions we have in the market, I suggest quizzes, tests, complicated procedures, and we decided to build something based on a simple interview with people, open questions, and we targeted that field. And after examining it, we understood that we need to understand what is a culture initially, and then concentrate better on culture, and then to solve another issue, recruiting problem. I hope it was understandable. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to tell about our idea. Was it understandable? Yes.
That's fine, you imagine.
That's fine, okay. And so it was like you told that the innovation, it was done like by the book. We started from collecting ideas, then we targeted the field, and we did interviews, and then during the interviews we understood that we need to target another issue. The problem was in another field. We thought the problem was a pure technological solution for hiring, but it occurred they needed something more deep, something more insights for understanding people and their culture. Okay. It was very interesting to hear you and to understand that we are on the right side. I would like to ask, are there any techniques? How could we make possible to go beyond these obvious ideas? How can we shorten this path, if it's correct to say so? Are there any techniques? What would you suggest us to?
Yeah, I can tell you what we've been doing, and in fact, maybe some of the conceptual background as well. And again, I felt that for this session, I would not include those slides, so I will have to tell you without showing. But I'm happy to follow up with the visual of it. As I told you, pictures stay in our mind, and that's important. So, but imagine the following: imagine there are two people on a team, and you have an idea A, and you've been thinking about this idea. It's an obvious idea, right? Yeah. But also, while you were thinking about it, you had this little alpha idea that came with it as you were sitting in your house, not even in that workplace. And so imagine you have this A plus alpha, right? Something that you think is very wonderful, just little marginal thing that you thought about. Now your friend also was sitting at home, and they were thinking about B. And B is also an obvious idea. But also, he also was thinking about something cool and came with this beta thing, right? Now it's B plus beta, something marginally also important for him. Now, because A and B are more or less obvious, right? Then combination of A plus B is also something that, has been done, probably more innovative, but you can see some other company already working on it. Because, there's A, there's B, they connected those two things, and they're this big company that's already doing it, right? But because you're good friends and you're a small company and you're a startup, you're not big company, then people don't talk to each other, but you're small. You can basically call her up and say, listen, I got this alpha idea. And she says, well, I got this little beta idea. And guess what, guys? Nobody thought of alpha plus beta yet, right? So basically the idea, what I'm saying, that the combinatorial approach to generating new ideas is not something new. It's your ability as a team to do that. And one thing that I refer to as a tool is, matching the unexpected together. Seriously, you really scan the context of your problem. For example, if it's an HR context, you can think of, and you're trying to solve a cultural problem, right? So I'll give you an example. You can think, all right, what is a culture? And there's a good definition I gave you last time. I really love it. It's in fact, I believe, the shared understanding of the appropriate exercise of discretion, right? Things we do in a company that are not written down, but we do it because we understand each other, right? Without words. That's how I define culture, really. And so you say, what goes into it? I mean, certain rituals, right? How we have our coffee together, or maybe we eat, or this is how we greet each other in the mornings, or this is how we basically, help each other to do work if one is sick or can't really do it. So we say, okay, well, these are the engagement points, and you can write this down. You can say, okay, drinking, singing, maybe dancing, things we do, right? Or maybe exercising, it's sport. They say, wonderful. Now let's think about other things. Do you see things around in your office space or wherever you work? So yeah, it's the furniture. I see, really tired people running around. Maybe I see a water cooler. I see maybe an artwork on the wall. It's like, oh, great, let's write this down. So you write this out in the other column. Then randomly saying, let's match this up. So you take another group of people, you write these things down, and then you look at it together saying, how about we combine these two? And you suddenly combine the water cooler and people, and it's a known thing in most of the companies that the water cooler or cafeteria area is where people actually engaging formally, and that's where the interesting conversations happen. But often the formal meetings are not the ones that yield the results we want for a number of reasons, right? So any situation that you can really spark a conversation that is free, ability for you to collocate your team members in a way that facilitates the discussions. So the level of propinquity, that is the physical distance of your coworkers, has been proven to be one of the determining factors of how much creative interaction happens within a team, right? So there are all these tools that you can use to make your team more capable at routinely producing ideas that can eventually lead you to an insight, right? For me, I found that the complexity of this combinatorial engagement is often one of the most powerful tools. You trying, in effect, combine unexpected items is, in a way, a trigger that creates a tension, a friction in one's mind, which sparks a new perspective on a problem that is not obvious. It's almost you're tricking your mind to think about something in a very different way because you're combining things that are not combinable. Yeah, does it make sense? In many ways,
yes.
When we spoke about the knowledge generation, right, at this level, they say, well, how we push beyond this boundary. And Daniel spoke about, going through obvious insights and then sort of having that next idea. Is in many ways, and Nubar Afeyan, I don't know if you know, but was one of the founders of the FAST and an innovator in his own right. He defines innovation as a intellectual immigration. Okay, intellectual immigration, and I really like that definition because the way I defined innovation, apart from what we discussed, is that in many ways is your ability to cross that knowledge border that you have. That is how fast you can go to the edge of what you know, and then try to probe it and then go one step further than that. Yeah. So in a way, innovation is necessarily crossing that border of what between what you know and what you don't know. And a way to do it is really reach that border first, be comfortable step number, and think, well, the easiest way to do this is to really work with someone else because every other person has that extra, ability to provide that extra, perspective that will push you over that.
Yeah, thank you. It's really helping. Sometimes people think that only, for example, people who are dealing with the product directly, for example, marketing or another person, they are responsible for innovation and they are waiting for something, I don't know, or think that they are not capable of thinking, they are not creative or something like that, and something keeping them in these boundaries. But the person who is responsible for marketing, for example, we need to speak, to understand, to communicate. Yes, you are right. Thank you very much.
Yes, and just to you inspire me to really speak about this. This is again, a lot of information perhaps, but I feel compelled to share this. The very first tool, like you said, is really participation by everyone, because ideas come from all different places. Often you might have someone on a team that's very that is quiet but very observant. They might not speak a lot. They could be very short sentences they would use. You really want to encourage divergent thinking, that is thinking that goes against the obvious, right? And to do that, you almost want to encourage and where that type of thinking to thrive. When ideas are built upon one another, if someone suggests an idea, then other people just pick it up and run with it, and it becomes everyone's creation. So there is no competition. Yeah, there is this really open access to ideas and sharing. so a lot of it has to do with culture, as you said. A lot of it has to do with making sure that people feel safe, that they don't feel that they're saying something ridiculous. That in fact you encourage the crazier idea, the better. So having that level of comfort within the team goes a long way, not just in terms of the innovation results, but as I said earlier, in terms of building a really good collaborative team with high morale. And so just give you an example that Google has engaged. There's an extensive study they made of successful teams, and they really looked heavily at the data by examining the different composition of teams they had. They had teams that had very, very accomplished professionals with very high expertise in the domain field. And they had teams that were very diverse, very different in terms of the backgrounds, in terms of the demographics. They had teams that perhaps they were young. There were teams that have been remote or co-located. They've done many things, and there's one single criteria that was a good determinant of success of a team. And I'll let you guess what that was. You might be familiar with the study. In fact, my study team at MIT participated in a similar study. And while I'd like to open the floor if anyone wants to express their views, just give you an idea that in our case, we had special devices that every time we'd have a meeting, our conversations would be recorded, not for the content, but for the to be able to distinguish the speaker. And interestingly enough, that study also in many ways I think reflected what Google's study suggested. So what do you think was the single most important factor in team success?
I don't know, participation of as many people, yes, to the conversation.
You're right, it's very close. In fact, it was the frequency of participation. In other words, the more equitable the participation frequency, the more successful the team proves to be. That is, there are some people who talk a lot, like myself, and some people who are really use fewer words. What really matters not how much they talk, but how frequently they contributed. That is, if I got turned 3-4 times to speak, I might use more time to speak, but it was important for the other person to at least be able to speak as many times, that is to speak up 3 or 4 times. So it was really the frequency of participation that was one single strong determinant of team's success, ultimately collaboration and ultimately success. That was very interesting, to know, and I think there was a similar study or this outcome of the I don't remember the what the initiative was called, but I believe Kasparov, the chess player, following the Deep Blue laws. The Deep Blue laws, he had this initiative where they would, I believe you might know better or more about this, so please join the conversation. They designed a competition where combined teams of humans and AI and the machines, computers could compete against each other. And I believe there was a combination with a really powerful computers, teams that were just AI teams. There were teams that were just, human, masters, grandmasters. And apparently there were also teams that were, a combination of not so powerful computers and perhaps not so powerful human players. And again, I'll let you guess the outcome. If I recall correctly, the winning team turned out to be the combined team of not so talented chess players and not so powerful AI machines. Really giving some credence to this idea that the sum of the parts often could be much greater or different than the constituent parts, right? So that it's really the combination of your team and your ability to come up with something that is a combinatorial effect of your perspectives that could be really innovative, right? And everything else is less powerful. And truly, if you think about why companies and teams, get together to form companies, that really elucidates the requirement of the culture. Because imagine in all your businesses, after all, you can choose not to establish a team or not to establish a company or culture around it, but rather really truly outsource everything that you do. Is to have an engineering team that you can have a very well spec'd out requirement, and they can build your website or platform. Have a outsource a marketing team that would go and do a campaign for you, and then everything will come together, and you would have a little good website or a business proposition. Obviously, there is something to having a team and a culture around it that meets together and understand each other and work together closely. That makes it different. Now, it doesn't always work, right? That's why the importance of culture, as we stressed, is paramount. In fact, it is one of the key strategic resources, your ability to build culture. And I'll go even further to tell you this. And in many ways, you are the founders of your companies. You are the executives, and you, because of it's a startup environment, you are wearing many hats. You can be a developer, a coder, a marketing specialist, a business specialist. I mean, you're doing pretty much everything, right? Well, there's one role, and especially when the companies develop, the role of a manager that if I were to ask you what you think it might be, often I receive responses about project management, coordination, strategy, things we've been discussing. I have a different definition, and I have a good reason for that definition. And I'd like to pose this question. It will be the last question for today. What do you think is the functional role of a manager in a company? Which you all are, in addition to all these wonderful things that you're doing. What do you think is the functional role of a manager?
I think that to make the links, to understand everything, and to make speak everyone, and to listen, to listen, and to make everyone to participate to this conversation, I think.
Any other ideas?
Motivation, team motivation and encouragement.
Very good. Anything else?
It's also something like glue. I don't know, someone who is connecting people all together in one place.
No, I think you're quite right, Nelly and Irina, and thank you for your thoughts. I think you're quite right. And I guess another way to say it, and the way I like to phrase it, is that the functional role of a manager is culture building. So all other functions that often are performed by the managers are different functions. That is, we can really outsource and hire someone to do it. The key role of a manager is culture building. Because if you think it's a strategy, then you can hire and have a chief strategy officer to do it. Now, when you're small, of course, and you have to do all these things. But my point being is that when you wear the hat of a manager, your key role is the cultural building. And the good news is that unlike other functional roles, this type of leadership can really be present with all of your colleagues, right? It can be really something that is part of your culture, that everyone in the company sort of takes up that responsibility of being a culture influencer. And in many ways, on the visible part of it, it could be the hierarchy or the absence of thereof, right? I mean, things that you can really observe about the company. And in many ways, we all know that, especially in big companies, but also even in the little ones, there's all this informal structure of power, relationships, culture that is perhaps much more important in many ways. That whenever you come to a new company, figuring out, what and how to behave and who to report to and not unlike any other social setting. And hence perhaps, that unmet need that you were able to discover, that ability to, at least to a degree, to measure and explore the cultural dimension vis-a-vis applicant or recruitment process is indeed a difficult problem, and hence also interesting problem, because that's where the upside is. And so on this last note, I'd like to complete, because what Irina tells us is that you want to focus on challenging problems, on problems that are seemingly tough, and hence that's where the upside is. And this is exactly where you would apply the design thinking to try to come up with something that nobody really thought of or been able to implement. I'll be available for any additional questions. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Aikas.